Hello, welcome to the Week 6 lecture. This is Dr. Rebecca Wood, your instructor, and this week we will be discussing power, religion, and justice. Our first author this week is Niccolo Machiavelli, and he was deeply concerned with the stability of governments because of the state of Italy during his lifetime. During his lifetime, there were smaller city-states within Italy, and they were constantly at war with each other. This depleted the citizenry and made things very difficult. And so Machiavelli wrote that men loving according to their own free will and fearing according to that of the prince, a wise prince should establish himself on that which is in his own control. And so he believed that Italy and essentially all of mankind would be happier if there were a strong ruler that kept things orderly. And so he also wrote that the tremendous success of the conquering armies of Hannibal were due to his inhuman cruelty. And in this case, Machiavelli appears to be advocating cruelty with the idea that a lax general or a lax conqueror, one who would let people get away with too much, would fail, likely killed by his own army. And so we're still trying to come to terms with what Machiavelli believed was the right way for a ruler to have power and take power and maintain power, and his ideas still affect governments and political science today. Our next author is James Madison, and he was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and he was first elected to that body at the age of 25. And he worked with Thomas Jefferson on a document called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and it attempted to disestablished the Anglican Church, guaranteed full religious freedom to all citizens, at least of Virginia, and called for a complete separation of church and state. And that statute was defeated in 1779. It was kind of controversial at the time, and we're still discussing the separation of church and state here in the United States today. One reason James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wanted to have a ban on a state religion was that England, from which a lot of the settlers for the United States came from, had a state religion. Originally, that state religion was Catholicism, until King Henry VIII famously petitioned for a divorce from his first wife to marry Anne Boleyn. And there was a great deal of negotiation, there were arguments, there was discussion in many different sense of the word discussions, and so Henry VIII split or was kicked out of the Catholic Church, depending on how one looks at it. He was excommunicated before the entire episode was over, and he began a new Church of England. And so during this time, this also coincided with the development of Protestantism in much of the rest of Europe. There were years of conflict and outright warfare as a result of Henry's break and Protestantism breaking from the Catholic Church. And King Henry VIII eventually seized the church's property in England and distributed it to his friends and allies. So the fact that King Henry VIII just changed the church in England, but still had a church, and then essentially ran it himself as kind of part of the government. Those were main reasons that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson did not want a state religion in the United States. And so later on, Madison wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments, and he said, the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. And he said this right is in its nature an unalienable right, and he stated that religion should be exempt from the authority of the society at large, meaning my religion can be different than your religion, and the state cannot tell us which of our religions is valid and which is not. Our next author this week is Martin Luther King Jr., and he believed in nonviolent civil disobedience. And I actually was a child when Martin Luther King was alive before he was assassinated, also during my childhood. And so his work affected me not only in an academic way, but in a personal way, because I remember those days very vaguely, but it was a tense time and there were very bad things happening. And if you watch the video of the letter from Birmingham jail, you'll see many of those images, some of which are familiar to me from my childhood. And Austin, our author of the textbook, said that he believed that we can disobey unjust laws publicly and to accept the consequences of that disobedience. And then during Reverend King's lifetime, Jim Crow laws ensured that whites and blacks in America remained segregated in all areas of public life, on buses, on railroads, in schools, in restaurants, and elsewhere. And you may remember some of the stories of people who protested being forced to go to the back of the bus or not being allowed to eat in a certain restaurant. And so those things happened during Martin Luther King Jr.'s time working as a civil rights advocate. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. He wrote that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. And it's very interesting that that kind of is in a little bit of conflict with Madison and Jefferson. And they said that there was no state law. But then Martin Luther King Jr., who was a reverend as well, brought in the idea of the law of God being a valid reason for having certain laws in our government. So there's a conflict there, as you can see, that makes it very interesting as a field to talk about and think about. And Martin Luther King wrote that we can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. And our final author this week was Desmond Tutu, and he wrote about the struggle against apartheid. And apartheid, according to Austin's book, began in 1948 and favored the white population even though they made up less than 10% of the total population. And Desmond Tutu was an Anglican bishop. And so, as you've noticed, there's other references to the Anglican Church through these reading assignments. And throughout his career, he continued his resistance to apartheid and his advocacy of nonviolent resistance in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And Tutu wrote about how South Africa, in the aftermath of apartheid, chose a compromise that offered amnesty for those who gave a full disclosure relating to their crimes. And so they didn't decide to forget everything that happened during apartheid, but they also didn't want to have trials like in Nuremberg after World War II with the Nazis. And now, transitioning to a different topic, I'd like to give a couple of hints or several hints for faster, easier paper writing. So I'll read kind of some of these and you can read them as well. Whenever possible, choose a topic about which you already have some knowledge. Can you use other sources you've already used this term, but in a different way, and of course document them again. If you are reading material in our textbook or a book for your paper 2 or any other material for school, skim read it first and then read it in more details. That's how you can make sure that you kind of get the major big idea and you know who the characters are and what's going on, and then you can read it for more details and analyze it. In an emergency, just skim read your material. Do what you have to do to complete your classes successfully. Take notes while you are reading. Keep your project manageable. Don't add a lot of extra work. It would be really super to write about all of the Hunger Games books, but that's an awful lot of extra work. I think I'll just write about the first book. Split the project into parts. Read and write some every day. Don't save everything for the last minute. And I say that as someone who has occasionally saved things for the last minute, and it is always painful. Read your literature out loud if it's hard to understand it. This week we had a piece or two that would benefit from that. Write fast and edit more carefully, so that way you're not all stressed out about being perfect as you're writing your first draft. Document all material from sources carefully as you write. I say this many, many times to my students. Do not go back and have to do the documentation later. You can pick a book that you've already read, especially for paper 2. You will still need to get a copy to skim through again to choose some meaningful passages to discuss. Pick a shorter and/or easier read, and watching a movie version of your chosen book could help you speed through the book and understand it. However, in this assignment, the movie is not going to be able to take the place of the book, but you can use it in addition to the book and then make it one of your sources as well. And this is my works cited page for this presentation. I have not documented the images that were from the Creative Commons, but I've documented everything else, I hope. And so this is the works cited and the type of works cited that you all should be doing for your papers. Notice that I have separated out the work by Austin, our book editor, from the essays and information from our actual authors inside the book. So I hope you have a great week, and please feel free to ask questions if you have any. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.